You know, our story today should be of extreme interest to a number of Dutch hunters. I'm sure that every one of us has been exposed to a situation where we were in a conversation with somebody, not talking about anything in particular, but something is said that triggers a memory that you haven't thought of for years. In fact, it happens a lot to me, and I'm sure it happens a lot to others. I got a phone call not very long ago from a friend who had went to Texas with another guy, and I'm not going to mention his name because he doesn't want to be harassed by phone calls seeking more information. But they were down there for some time and were allowed to go through just about everything that the relative of Travis Tumlinson had in storage. They were looking for a particular map, but they didn't find it. And in storage was also all of his grandfather's stuff and maps that of Peg-Leg Pete Tumlinson. Now, in telling this story, he was on the phone with the relative of Tumlinson down in Texas when it triggered a memory of his. And that memory was where he was with Tom Collenborn one time, and they were driving up Hewlett Canyon. And they had been talking on and off, as we do on trips like that, but they hadn't been talking for a few minutes when they got to Bayous Butte area, and Tom pointed off to the west and said, "This is where Bob Garman got all his money." Well, that didn't mean a whole lot to my friend at the time. Just like when I read this book years ago by Bob Garman, I found the clue that got me started on researching the Lost Dragoon pistols. Pete knew that Whitlow Dam was going to be built, and in order to maintain water rights, the ditch, the irrigation ditch that Hart Mullins had dug himself, had to be maintained in a way that would carry water. And we're standing next to that ditch today. And he took me down, he said, "We'll start at the Narrows." And that's just about where we are now, the dam in the background.
Now you have a book.
I have a book.
That where it talks about the Narrows.
This was written in 1974 by Bob Garman. And I bought this in 1976 and read it, and there was an article a page in there that mentions supplies would be available a place called the Narrows along Queen Creek where the flood control dam is, and commonly called the Narrows. Well, I didn't know anything about the Lost Dragoon pistols at that time, but when I read the story, the story was published in 3 different parts in a newspaper, written by a friend of mine, and it never mentioned anything until the last part of it. It mentioned the Narrows. So I knew exactly where we were talking about. Everybody, you know, the story told about a dominant pointed peak, which everybody thinks was Weaver's Needle, and they were attacked right here where that dam is by the Apaches. Now, when somebody tells you a story, it's kind of hard to document anything, and I like to do some research on anything anybody tells me. But I decided to go back and take another look at this book. And things that I read in 75 when I purchased this book, I had blown over because I had not yet heard anything about the Tumlinsons. They didn't mean anything to me. But in this book is several references to them. In fact, Bob Garman states in here that he run across R.G. Tumlinson and his nephew. His nephew, of course, would have been Travis. And they became friends because the Tumlinsons shared some information with Mr. Garman. There's another picture in here, taken in 1951, we'll share, where you see Hart Mullins, Bob Garman, and Jesse Mullins setting stakes for a claim. And in the background, I have drawn a circle around between 2 of the 3 red hills you can clearly see where we went to look for the lost mine found, which had a question mark behind it. The way up here, we saw all the symbols are on the maps. We saw the 3 red hills. We saw everything that applies to the Lost Dutchman, and I can see why Hart believes this is a Peralta dig.
We got pictures of the panorama there from the Ruth map, the 3 red hills. It is an amazing thing that lends a little bit of credence to it being on the east side and not the west. And it's been 60 years for you.
60 years.
Been here. I'm impressed. But we made it, and it was well worth the trip. It took us, what, 3.5 hours?
4.5 hours.
4.5 hours to get here.
And I'll tell you what, I don't recommend anybody come up here and spend 4.5 hours to get to this spot. You can watch what we're doing, and you'll know as much as we do.
Yeah, so there you go. This is not something that you should come and try to look for. But it's Hart Mullen's mine, and he believed... Well, you tell the story. Tell us a little bit about it.
If you recall, in our previous episodes, I had told you that my dad retired out here in Mesa, and I was working for Pete Allen at Queen Valley, and Pete must have introduced my dad to Hart because I'd never met him, and they all pulled in the yard one day, and so since I was there, I went along, and we went to Elephant Butte and Buzzard's Roost to some claims they had, and then Hart brought us up here. And it wasn't near as brushy as it is now.
Obviously, nobody's been up here for quite some time. We had to actually make a trail, yeah.
But Hart told us the entire legend right here in this spot about the Lost Dutchman. First time I had ever heard it, 1958. First time my dad had ever heard it. And then he brought us here, and he claimed that he believed this was one of the Peralta mines. And he was working it. He left, that's a redwood ladder. It hasn't aged much at all, but this cutout wasn't here at the time. And he died in 1960, so he's been a couple of years for the work on this.
You think that's his ladder?
I think that's his ladder,
okay.
Now that I see how difficult it was to get in here, and nobody's been here for ages. And you might want to review that story, because in that story, I made it very clear that they weren't digging in an ore body. They were looking for a cache. Okay, well, it appears that somebody found one. And I hesitate to repeat how much money I was told was in the possession of these people at one time. Now, Travis Tumlinson died in 1961, and his brother Robert turned over to Bob Garman everything that they had, because once Travis died, he gave up on what they were doing. But by this time, they had already found that cache and were looking for another one. You might recall in one story by Clay Wurst, where he stated,
and one morning, very early when she went to work, the Dutchman was failing. So she left to go find a doctor. And as she left on the street, she met 2 men, Gideon Roberts and Dick Holmes. Now, Gideon Roberts was an intimate friend of the Dutchman. We believe that Gideon Roberts traveled with the Dutchman from Castroville, Texas, to the California gold fields, then up to the Prescott area, and then finally down to Phoenix, where the Roberts homestead was adjacent to the Dutchman's homestead. They were dear friends. Dick Holmes was with Roberts. He was only a casual acquaintance of the Dutchman. But because of his presence with his dear friend Gideon Roberts, the Dutchman simply accepted Dick Holmes as being a reliable person. So Julia asked Roberts and Holmes to sit with the Dutchman while she went for the doctor. Well, she was delayed 2 hours. The doctor was delivering a baby. And by the time she got back, the Dutchman had died. Well, in the 2 hours that Julia was gone, the Dutchman made what we call his deathbed revelation to Holmes and Roberts. Now there was on the western frontier, even among unchurched people, the idea that on your deathbed you make what they called your final confession. They called it making your peace. And it was in those 2 hours that the Dutchman told to Holmes and Roberts the circumstances of him discovering the mine and trying to direct Dick Holmes back to the mine. He picked Dick Holmes because Gideon Roberts was the Dutchman's age. He was an old man in feeble health himself. In fact, Roberts died just a few months after the Dutchman died of silicosis. They called it miner's disease in those days. In telling about the mine, he told Dick Holmes, he said, "Under my bed in a miner's candle box is what I have left of the ore out of the mine." He said, "I made 3 caches back there. I didn't trust banks. I made 3 caches of gold back in the mountains. A large cache and 2 small caches. But," he said, "I went back later and I packed one of the small caches out. It's what I've been living on all these years." And he said, "What's left of it is in a miner's candle box under my bed." He said, "Dick, get it out." Holmes got it out. It was heavy. The Dutchman told him to open it. And when he did, Holmes could scarcely believe his eyes. There was nearly 50 pounds, 48.5 pounds actually, of incredibly high-grade ore in that candle box, richer than anything Holmes had ever dreamed of. And Holmes was somewhat of a prospector. In fact, his father was a graduate of the university in Ann Arbor, Michigan, with a degree in geology and mineralogy. Holmes had some background.
The Dutchman had told Julia Thomas that he had 3 caches, and the one under his bed was one of the smaller ones that he was living on all these years. So the Tumlinsons would have been aware of this story because they knew Herman Petrasch. Herman Petrasch lived out there just about 3 miles east of the dam at Queen Valley, and they visited him often. In fact, in the book here, Bob Garman states that he had visited Herman, and Herman had stated, you know, Herman always had the idea at the end of his life that the mine was somewhere around Iron Mountain. And he wanted to do another trek to look for it because he wanted to just simply prove that the mine existed while he was still alive. And Bob arranged for 6 people to go out on a trek and take Herman with them. So when he showed up the very next morning, the Martin family was there at Petrasch's shack, I should say, and we've got a picture of that shack. It was torn down by the Martins, but in 1958, I'm pretty sure that shack was still there because I used to drive by there all the time. And I remember the tires being on the roof of this building and didn't even know what it was. Anyway, the Martins were there at Herman's shack because Herman passed away that very next day that they had planned this trek. I showed you the picture of Garman and Hart Mullins and Jesse taken in 1951. All these people, the Tumlinsons, the Martins, Herman Petrasch, and the Mullinses all knew each other. And I think Bob did not deliberately put some things in this book because you might remember that in 1934, Franklin Delano Roosevelt outlawed the ownership of gold. So they found something. What are they going to do with it? you know, you weren't allowed to own gold until 1974. Well, turns out that another part of the memory, the puzzle that triggered my memory was I was with Tom Collenborn one time, and we were just arriving in Patsy Junction, and he says, "You don't mind if I stop and see somebody for a minute, do you?" And I said, "No, let's go." So we went to a trailer court behind Arnold's Automotive Center in Apache Junction. And over in the southeast corner, we pulled up to an older trailer that just, you know, wasn't dilapidated, but it wasn't new by any means. And we went inside, and there was Bob Garman. Now, Bob Garman's wife had passed away several years before this, and Garman gave Tom Collenborn a box full of material. And I don't remember all what was discussed, but I remember distinctly that there was a lot of pictures and slides in that box. And Tom was given the box, and we left. And a few months later, Bob Garman died. He died in 1984, so this was 84 that we were there. So while visiting Tom and bringing up the subject about Mr. Garman dying, Tom told me that Garman had a considerable amount of cash in his home when he died. There again, I'm not going to tell you how much money I was told that Bob had. Well, 84 was 10 years after you were allowed to own gold. So whatever they found, he probably waited many years before he cashed it in, which it was worth considerably more money in 84 than it was in 34. Well, this jibed with what my friend had told me about Tom telling him that this is where Bob Garman found all his money. So the canyons that Tumlinsons would have been searching the most in, east of Miner's Needle, south to Queen Creek, would have been Whitlow Canyon, Millsite Canyon, and Hewlett Canyon. And I know from Bob Garman's book here that they spent a great deal of time in Millsite, which is just over the ridge from Hewlett. But whatever they found was up by Bayous Butte in Hewlett Canyon. So some kind of cash was evidently found. And when I met up with the Mullinses, and they took us on a trip with my father to various places where they had claims and up to the Pit Mine. Now, I often refer to this as a mine, but you know, I had distinctly made it known that they were looking for a cache. And at the extreme west end of the Three Red Hills is a very small one, just as red as the rest of them. And all the colors turn abruptly as it goes uphill. When we were there in 1958, the Mullinses were working on that small hill and had a claim there. And there was a road that you can barely see anything left of it in the picture because the Forest Service had put boulders across the entrance down by the spring, and you can't get up in there anymore. Well, this area in this small red hill, what you might call the fourth red hill, but it's nowhere near the size of the rest of them, is very close to the area where the story that my friend told me that the relative in Texas had told him is where they found the cache that they were talking about. Now, they also told the story, and Mr. Texas told the story, of how when Travis Tumlinson died, his wife went on a spending spree. And the story went that it was a considerable spending spree. Well, we do know that she received a couple of $1,000 or so, give or take, when she sold the stone maps after Travis died. Well, back in the 60s, 1961, a couple of $1,000 was a lot of money. But the story implied that it was considerable bigger buying spree than even $2,000 could imagine. So there we have it. He even described where the cache was found was sort of a natural small cutout in the side of the mountain. Nothing unusual. It certainly wasn't a cave or anything like that, but it was within 500 yards of where they were still searching for a cache. So if the Dutchman had one of the caches, the small one, and they had found one already, there was still one left. And we don't know if it was the small one they found or the large one that they found. You know, whatever it was that Tumlinson and Garman found, they couldn't tell anybody because gold was outlawed and they would have got it confiscated. But now that they've passed away, we're never really going to know the source of their wealth. And that's just another mystery of the Superstition Mountains.
Thank you for watching this episode of Mysteries of the Superstition Mountains.